GoForThe2.com in with the Week 3 college predictions. Week number 2 did not disappoint with top 25 upsets across the landscape. We saw Texas A&M get knocked off by Miami 48-33. The upset of the day happened in Tuscaloosa with Texas knocking off Alabama, handing the Crimson Tide only their second home loss since 2016. They stepped up in a big way. Quinn Ewers found Xavier Worthy. The defense forced some turnovers against Jalen Milroe, and that was a dynamic effort for the Texas Longhorns. We also saw a thriller in Lubbock with Oregon covering and winning that ball game in the final 36 seconds with a pick six by Tyler Shuck. Unbelievable in terms of the outcome of that matchup. A sizzler, pick six with 30 seconds left. Texas Tech was driving for a potential game-winning field goal. Dynamic effort by the Oregon defense. It sets the stage for a fantastic week number 3. Due to the schedule, it's going to be more of a rapid-fire video. I'm going to try and get in all 7 games and break them down as best as possible. But again, if you want all the analysis, all the breakdowns for the top 25, under-the-radar picks, prop bets, tune into the coverage throughout SportsGrid and SiriusXM Channel 159. I'm on Carver and Lisi every Monday through Friday, 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. We give our picks out on Friday night in terms of games that you might not hear in terms of this video, so tune in throughout the week. And then college football today starts 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. We get you covered for kickoff. SportsGrid.com on the video side, SiriusXM Channel 159 for the audio. And then if you want an NFL fix, I'm part of the Pro Football Today coverage live every Saturday, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. We'll be throughout the year broadcasting live from the Ocean Casino in Atlantic City. We were there this past week. We'll be back in week number 5, so tune in. Check us out if you're in the area. Say hi. You can always reach me out on Twitter at GoForThe2. That's the number 2. We'll jump in. 7 picks on the video. Very SEC heavy this week, but again, this is what I see early on. You could always tweet me or hit me up throughout the week. So Big Ten battle, Penn State on the road facing off against Brett Bielema in Illinois. Illinois did not play well last Friday night against Jalen Daniels and Kansas. They lose that ball game by 11. We're in striking distance within the fourth quarter because of their ability to run the football, but just too little too late. The defense gave up a lot of chunk plays in terms of the passing game, gave up a lot of yards on the ground to Jalen Daniels and the Kansas rushing attack as well. I'm expecting a bounce-back effort. This is one of the better defenses last year, especially in the secondary perspective. They forced 24 interceptions, held opposing quarterbacks to 54% completion percentage. 2 of those starters moved on to the NFL. This is a defense now giving up 254 passing yards per game and over 220 rushing yards to opposing offenses. A bright spot is the rushing attack for Illinois. They're still averaging 4.8 yards per carry. That I think will carry well in this ball game at home in Champaign, even though Penn State's the dominant side. They have Singleton, they have Allen, they have their new quarterback, Drew Aller, on the road going into this ball game, making his first career road Big Ten start. I know the numbers favor Penn State, but I think this is a bounce-back spot for Illinois. I like the versatility and mobility of Luke Altmaier, the quarterback. He made a lot of plays in terms of the second half on the ground, and I think that potentially could be a recipe or a game plan to attack the Penn State defense in this ballgame. When you look at this, Penn State has a potential look ahead with Iowa next week, even though it's the first Big Ten game, even though numbers favor Penn State. I'm expecting the offense and defensive lines for Illinois under Bielema to bounce back in a big way. Playing at home, I think they're in this number from start to finish, catching 14.5. I think it's the mobility of Altmaier. The rushing attack bounces back with Reggie Love. Illinois pushes Penn State to the limit in Champaign Saturday at noon. Another big ball game takes place in the SEC at noon. LSU on the road against Mississippi State. LSU beat up on Grambling 72-10. They bounce back. Dynamic effort through the air and on the ground. This is an offense now in LSU that is averaging 333 through the air, over 220 yards on the ground. Jaden Daniels playing lights out, 651 passing yards, 6 touchdowns, 1 interception. You look at just LSU as a whole. They've won 2 straight in the series, by an average margin of victory of 9 points per game. Picked up this victory last year, 31-16. And when you look at Mississippi State, they struggled with Arizona last week at home. They got pushed to the limit as a 9.5-point favorite. Pulled that ball game out 31-24. You look at the defense right now by Mississippi State. They allowed 340 passing yards to Arizona and Delora, their quarterback. Just not a very good effort. And when you look at Zach Arnett and the coaching perspective going up against Brian Kelly, give the edge to Kelly on the road. Since 2017, dating back to his days in terms of Notre Dame, 27-12 straight up. I give the quarterback advantage in this ballgame to Jaden Daniels over Will Rogers, even though Will Rogers, 389 yards, 5 touchdowns, one interception on the year. I still think it comes down to the interior offense and defensive lines. LSU, I think, bounces back. First SEC road game. Even though it's Stark Vegas, I do feel LSU wins this ball game convincingly, anywhere from 17 to 20 points Saturday afternoon. Look for them to throw it first. That'll open up the rushing attack for Josh Williams and even Jaden Daniels in this ball game. Another big battle in terms of the SEC, potentially, in my opinion, a dark horse. Keep an eye out for Ole Miss. They struggled for basically 3 quarters last week against Tulane. They've now won 13 straight against Tulane. They were up by 7, get a late field goal. They get the scoop and score, win that ball game by 17 points without Michael Pratt. But this is still an offense that's hubbing right now. They're averaging 399 passing yards per game, only averaging around 143 yards on the ground. They were held to basically 89 last week with Judkins and a very stellar front 7 of Tulane. But now they face Georgia Tech. They have Alabama on deck. There's always the potential for the look ahead. But when you just look at Georgia Tech, they're playing well from an offensive perspective. Haynes King and that offense putting up numbers. But I have concerns about the defense. That's where I think Georgia Tech is up against it. Looking for Judkins and the tempo of Ole Miss to wear down Georgia Tech. They don't have a sack all year, Georgia Tech. The front 7's not getting pressure. They certainly didn't do it week 1 against Louisville and Jack Plummer. This is going to be a tall order against Jackson Dart. He's playing well within the scheme. I think he could attack that defense over the top, especially in terms of third downs. If you can't get quarterback pressures and Ole Miss can sustain drives, that means that Haynes King and that offense are playing from a deficit. I think this potentially could be one of the better teams in the SEC West. They were a 29-1 shot to win it in terms of Ole Miss. They're playing well. The defense is holding opposing offenses to 186 passing yards per game. They have the ability to make Haynes King and that offense one-dimensional. They got quarterback pressures when the game was on the line. I like the way the front 7 is played. I like Ole Miss in a rout in this ballgame. They'll lay in a big number, 19.5, 20.5. But I think Ole Miss potentially, if they get this victory and play well against Alabama and somehow shock the Alabama Crimson Tide in Tuscaloosa, don't look now, but they could be potentially the best team with LSU the rest of the way in terms of going toe-to-toe in the SEC West. I like what Lane Kiffin has from an offensive perspective. They're throwing it a little bit more than they're running it. In big picture, that bodes well for the Ole Miss faithful and Ole Miss long-term as they face the teams like LSU and Alabama a little bit later in the year. Another battle in terms of Georgia and South Carolina. Georgia laying a huge number, 27.5 to Spencer Rattler in South Carolina. South Carolina did not look good week number 1. They lost that matchup by 2 touchdowns to North Carolina. They only rushed for -2 yards in the game. Offensive line couldn't get a push. They were inconsistent. But one thing that is consistent is Spencer Rattler and that passing attack. They are passing for 408 yards per game, only rushing in the area of about 58 yards per game. But Rattler has completed 83% of his passes. He's playing clean with the football, hasn't turned the football over, and now they go on the road to Athens. It's a rivalry game. This is one of the most underrated rivalries in terms of all of the SEC. Georgia and South Carolina do not like each other. This is Carson Beck's first SEC game. Georgia since 2020 is 15-0 at home. They were 6-0 at home last year, won those games by an average margin of victory of 24.3 points per game. They dominated their first two opponents, but this is an SEC opponent, and I give Rattler the edge in terms of the experience playing in the conference, playing on the road, playing in a big game. Rattler over Carson Beck up until this point, laying almost 4 touchdowns. I think South Carolina is well within the number. Don't be shocked if the Gamecocks push Georgia to the limit. And if Georgia's going to win this ball game, they need the rushing attack to take the pressure off of Carson Beck. Why is that important? Back since 2016, when you look at the numbers, Georgia, every time they pound the rock for over 200 against FCS and FBS opponents, an amazing 45-0 against that competition. They were 41-0 since 2016 against FBS opponents. Every time they pound the rock, they won those games over 200 by 28.8 points per game. Last year, they were 8-0. Every time they rushed for over 200, won by 27.5 points per game. The rushing attack is going to be critical to not only winning this ball game, but getting this cover against South Carolina Saturday afternoon. I think the Gamecocks are live with that. Tennessee on the road in another rivalry game against Florida. Tennessee got this victory last year, 38-33. They won, but didn't cover the 11.5 point number. Anthony Richardson got a backdoor touchdown with about 2 minutes left in that ball game. Florida has won 4 of the last 5. You look at this offense right now for Tennessee. They won 30-13 last week against Austin Peay. Joe Milton completed 66% of his passes, over 480 yards, right in the area of about 489, 4 touchdowns, no interceptions. Tennessee is doing it on the ground, 257 per game on the ground during their first 2 games, only 220 through the air. Third downs are only 37%. Why is that important? When we look at the difference last year with Hendon Hooker and Joe Milton this year, a little more run heavy. And that goes right into the strength of Florida's defense right now. Florida only given up in the area of about 105, maybe even a little bit less. They gave up 105 to Utah week 1, but they're giving up maybe 87 rushing yards per game. If they can't run the football effectively, are they going to be able to throw it over the top the way they were able last year? The difference last year is with Hendon Hooker, they averaged around 326 passing yards per game. They were in the area of about 50% of third down conversions. Hendon Hooker, through his 2 years in Knoxville, 58 touchdowns, only 5 interceptions. And that's not even what he did in terms of his versatility with the rushing attack. Is Milton leading the same type of offense? Are they playing with the same type of tempo early on? We don't see that. They're not as consistent on third downs. That's a cause of concern going into a rivalry game against a very good underdog coach. Now, Billy Napier last year, 5-1 against the number as an underdog. He lost a bowl game against Oregon State, and he lost this year as an underdog against Utah. But this is a bounce-back spot. They're playing at home. They can erase that week 1 matchup. Graham Mertz potentially could bounce back. The rushing attack got going with a 327-yard effort against McNeese State. I think they potentially can run the football, sustain drives, and keep Joe Milton on the sidelines, catching 7.5. I think Florida's live in this ball game. Keep an eye out. This could be one of the most intriguing games at 3:30. I think Florida's live within the number Saturday afternoon against the Tennessee Volunteers. Another big ball game. San Diego State versus Oregon State. Now, San Diego State got blown out by UCLA. They haven't been running the football effectively. They got shut down last week by a bigger, more physical front seven. You look at the numbers, it looks like San Diego State's running the football, $173 on the ground. But you look, most of that was due to their week 2 effort against Idaho State. Now, they've played UCLA, they played Ohio, and they have played Idaho State. So that's 3 opponents. When you look at the flip side for Oregon State, they beat up on Chevin Cordero. He got hurt in that game, and San Jose State. And they also beat up on UC Davis. So the numbers are gaudy against inferior competition. But the one thing I do like is the secondary of San Diego State, holding opposing quarterbacks to 52% completion percentage and have forced 6 interceptions. We all know about DJU. He's playing well in Corvallis. Rushing attack is there. But this is a big game. San Diego State maybe their toughest opponent from a defensive perspective. They can run it. They're going on the road. I think Oregon State wins, but I don't think they cover the 24.5-point number against the Aztecs. I know that the Aztecs got blown out by UCLA, but I think they can run the football, again, shorten the game, and I like the defensive secondary to force some turnovers over DJU in that ball game. So I think San Diego State could be live with the big number in Corvallis. Last matchup, Minnesota Big Ten team going up against Mac Brown and Drake May. Drake May and North Carolina struggled mightily last week as a 19-point favorite against App State. Joey Aguilar and App State was in a position to pull that ball game out, at least tie it in terms of overtime. They couldn't do it. UNC prevails 40-34. But a couple of factors why I favor Minnesota here. Now, you have two different types of teams. You have a ground and pound type of team in terms of Minnesota. They pounded the rock last week against Eastern Michigan for over 250 yards. That's a gutty effort. Now they go on the road to face an offense that's prolific in terms of Drake May, averaging well over 30 points per game. But North Carolina's front seven allowed 219 yards to App State on the ground, going up against a bigger, more physical offensive line, Big Ten offensive line. I favor the Minnesota Golden Gophers. Also, PJ Fleck, dating back to 2019 as a road coach, ATS 11-6-2. He's a very good road coach, at least throughout his tenure in Minnesota, even dating back to his days in Western Michigan, catching 7.5. I think the physicality of Minnesota could be the difference, playing up against a more finesse type of team. I like Minnesota to potentially win this ball game outright, catching 7.5. There's the 7 picks for week number 3. I'll go through them rapid fire. I like Illinois plus the points against Penn State. LSU minus the 9.5 against Mississippi State. I like Ole Miss laying the 19.5, 20.5 against Georgia Tech. I like South Carolina plus the 27.5 against Georgia. Like Florida plus the 7.5 against Tennessee. Like San Diego State plus the 24.5 against Oregon State. And like Minnesota plus the 7.5 against North Carolina. Hope you have a great week. I'll see you throughout the week, and I'll also see you on Saturday on College Football Today.